Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
They say family is everything, but what they don't tell you is that family is also where your deepest wounds come from, and not the kind that bleed, the kind that sit inside you for years, like a cracked rib you never let heal right. And sometimes, the worst betrayal doesn't come in the form of screaming matches or slammed doors. Sometimes, it comes with a laugh and a joke tossed like a beer can across a backyard, while everyone around you chuckles and nods and pretends not to notice how hard it hit. That's exactly what happened to me one Saturday in July, in my own backyard, during what was supposed to be a laid-back family barbecue I'd been guilted into hosting. A hot, sticky day filled with bratwursts, beer coolers, folding chairs that squeaked under the weight of distant cousins, and a bunch of people who only showed up for free food and the illusion of family closeness. I remember the sky was hazy, the kind of pale blue that looks like it's too tired to be summer anymore, and the grill was hissing like it had something to say. My mom had brought her infamous potato salad in that same blue glass dish from 1988, and the kids were chasing each other with squirt guns while the grown-ups huddled near the TV I'd dragged out to the patio so nobody would miss the game. Everything smelled like charred meat, sunscreen, and passive aggression. And in the middle of it all was my younger brother, Matt, sunburned, shirt half untucked, drink already in hand before noon, grinning like he owned the place. Which, of course, he didn't. I did. Every plank of that deck, every paycheck that bought the steaks and paid for the oversized umbrella he was sitting under, that was all mine. And yet, somehow, he always managed to act like he was the host, and I was just the woman lucky enough to be related to him. See, Matt's always had this way of being charming in that lazy, used car salesman kind of way. Women used to fall for it. Bosses used to tolerate it. And family? Family made excuses for it. Especially our mom, who still called him my baby, even though he's 41 and has a receding hairline and a resume that reads like a graveyard of burned bridges. But that day, I wasn't thinking about all that. I was just trying to keep the beer cold, the burgers flipped, and the conversation light enough to avoid politics or old resentments. That is, until my phone buzzed, a text from a client I'd been trying to close for weeks. The kind of client that could mean a big bump for the company I built from the ground up with no investors, no husband, no loans, and no brother to lean on. Just grit, late nights, and the kind of loneliness that no one claps for. So I stepped away, just behind the garage, into a sliver of shade where the signal was decent and the noise of the barbecue was faint. I didn't think anything of it, took the call, smiled into my phone, gave the pitch, held my breath when she said she'd think about it. It lasted maybe 8 minutes, 10 tops. And when I came back, something shifted. I caught the tail end of a joke, that murmur of laughter you can feel in your bones before you even hear the words. Matt was the loudest, lounging in a lawn chair, sunglasses pushed up like a movie star, his voice booming above the crowd like some drunk MC at a sad little roast. "Don't worry, Ratch," he shouted, raising his solo cup like a toast. "You can watch the highlights online." And just like that, I felt the air leave my lungs. Not because of the words themselves, hell, they weren't even that clever, but because of how everyone reacted. The snorts, the sideways glances, the awkward laughs followed by that dead silence people do when they're too scared to pick a side. He turned me into a punchline. Not just me, my work, my focus, the way I've had to hustle twice as hard just to get half as much respect as any man in our family. And what hurt the most wasn't that he said it. It was that no one, not one damn person, told him to shut up. Not even our mother, who was standing right there spooning more salad onto his plate. I smiled. Not because I found it funny, but because that's what you do when you're a woman in charge. You learn to smile when people take shots at you, when men who've never carried what you carry try to shrink you down to something small enough to laugh at. I laughed along, nodded, even clinked my drink against his in a little mock cheers. But inside? Inside I was ice. Not angry. Not even hurt. Just frozen in that kind of stillness that only comes when a switch flips and everything you thought you'd tolerate suddenly becomes intolerable. And the thing is, he had no idea. None of them did. They kept laughing, kept eating, kept talking over each other about the game and the food and how Rachel finally loosened up. But while they were distracted, I walked inside, opened my laptop, and logged into our payroll system. It took me less than 3 minutes to remove him. No warning. No confrontation. Just a quiet delete. His name disappeared like it was never there. One click and poof, the paycheck stopped. His sense of entitlement? Still very much intact. But the money? Gone. I walked back outside and poured myself another drink, sat down beside my cousin like nothing had happened. I even offered Matt another burger later, handed it to him with a smile so sweet it could rot teeth. He grinned back, oblivious, probably thinking he'd gotten away with another little jab. But in my mind, I was already miles ahead. I wasn't just planning revenge, I was already executing it. And here's the kicker, I didn't do it to be petty. I did it because at some point, when you're a woman who builds something from nothing, you get real tired of being the butt of the joke at your own party. You get tired of being told you're too serious, or too cold, or too much, just because you don't let men like Matt get away with their bullshit. So yeah, he laughed. The whole backyard laughed. But I was the only one who knew, right then and there, that it was the last laugh he'd get on my dime. The thing about helping family is that once you do it long enough and often enough, they stop seeing it as help, it just becomes part of the landscape. Like the porch light you always leave on or the emergency $100 bill you pretend not to notice goes missing from your kitchen drawer after Thanksgiving. That's how it started with Matt. What began as a lifeline thrown to a drowning man slowly turned into a full-time rescue operation that nobody but me was steering, and for the longest time, I convinced myself that was just how things worked when you were the responsible one. The one with the savings account, the one who kept gas in the generator during storms, the one who paid her mother's dental bills without asking for anything in return. But looking back now, I think the first mistake I made wasn't hiring my brother, it was believing, for even a second, that he would ever take it seriously. It was about 6 years ago when Matt called me, voice low, sheepish, doing that thing he always did when he needed something, dragging his words out like he hated to ask, even though we both knew he'd already spent 2 weeks rehearsing exactly how he'd ask. He'd been fired again, this time from a warehouse job he swore was bullshit, and beneath him, even though he'd been desperate for it just 2 months earlier. His ex-wife was threatening court. The car was 2 payments away from being repossessed, and his credit cards had been maxed out on things he couldn't even name without checking the statements. He said he didn't need much, just something to get back on his feet, and I, in a moment of weakness or maybe misguided loyalty, told him I'd think about it. But I already knew I'd say yes. Because that's what I always did. I made room, even when I didn't have it. At the time, my company, a mid-sized logistics firm I'd built from scratch, starting with nothing but a rented storage unit and a laptop with a cracked screen, had just landed a new contract that required more hands on the back end. It wasn't glamorous work. It was paperwork, shipment tracking, customer service emails, the kind of job that required showing up on time, staying awake, and not insulting anyone. So I created a position for Matt, technically in operations, but let's be honest, it was a charity job with a padded salary and a corner of the office no one else wanted. I told myself I was giving him a fresh start. I told myself he'd grow into it, maybe find purpose. What I didn't tell myself, though I should have, was that men like Matt don't grow into jobs, they sink into them. The first month, he was all yes ma'ams and early mornings, bringing coffee to the receptionist and pretending to care about company updates. The second month, the tardiness began. At first it was just traffic, then car trouble, then I wasn't feeling great. By the third month, he was walking in halfway through team meetings with sunglasses still on and the smell of stale beer clinging to his breath like cologne. He had this way of charming people into thinking he was just quirky or creative, but I saw the truth, I saw the files he forgot to send, the clients he mishandled, the lazy replies that cost us credibility. I gave him warnings, soft ones at first, more like nudges than ultimatums. But every time I pulled him aside, he'd look at me with that same crooked smile and say something like, "Come on, Ratch, you know I'm not cut out for cubicles." As if I'd hired him into some 9-to-5 hellhole and not into a comfortable seat at a company he'd never have qualified for otherwise. And the worst part wasn't his attitude or the missed deadlines. The worst part was how he dropped my name whenever things went sideways. If a supplier called to complain, Matt would chuckle and say, "Hey, I'll talk to Rachel. She'll sort it out." If he didn't understand a task, he'd blame poor instructions, never once owning the fact that he hadn't read the damn email. Over time, he became this embarrassing shadow at company events, cracking jokes that fell flat, making off-color comments to interns, and worst of all, acting like his presence was a gift, like we were lucky to have him, when in reality, I was the only reason he still had a desk. My staff, the real backbone of the company, tiptoed around him, afraid to say anything because, after all, he was the boss's brother. And I let that go on far longer than I should have, partly because I didn't want to humiliate him, but mostly because I didn't want to hear my mother's voice in my head whispering, "He's family, Rachel. You don't turn your back on blood." So when he stood up at that barbecue, in front of everyone, and made that snide little comment that you can watch the highlights online line, it wasn't just a joke. It was the final proof that in his eyes, I wasn't a sister, a boss, or a human being. I was a walking wallet, a safety net with a face, someone to be mocked publicly because he never imagined there'd be consequences. I don't think he even meant it maliciously. I think that's the scariest part. He genuinely didn't think it mattered. He thought he was funny. Thought he was the star of the show. But what he didn't realize, what he's still probably trying to wrap his head around, is that everything he had at that job was borrowed. Borrowed name. Borrowed credibility. Borrowed time. And that night, when I quietly removed him from the payroll, without ceremony, without warning, without the dignity of a formal firing, I wasn't just reclaiming control of my company. I was reclaiming my damn name. Because if there's one thing I've learned in business and in life, it's that being generous without boundaries doesn't make you noble. It makes you a target. And when your own brother thinks your success is just background noise to his performance, that's when it's time to shut off the sound entirely. I didn't delete his email. I didn't revoke his keycard. I left everything else the same, because I wanted to see how long it would take for him to notice, how long until the illusion cracked. And I knew deep down that when it did, he wouldn't go quietly. He never does. The thing about pulling the rug out from under someone isn't the actual fall, it's the look on their face in the seconds before they hit the floor, the exact moment when the realization dawns that the ground they thought was solid was never theirs to begin with, that everything they took for granted wasn't a foundation, but a favor. When I deleted Matt from the payroll that night after the barbecue, one click, no confirmation email, no warning letter, I wasn't thinking about revenge, at least not in the cartoonish, cackling over a cauldron sense. I was thinking about balance, about recalibrating years of unspoken debts and swallowed pride, about silently drawing a line in the sand where none had been drawn before, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I finally understood that letting him float indefinitely on my dime was a kind of slow suicide I'd been committing under the banner of sisterhood. I figured it would take a week, maybe two, before he noticed. He wasn't exactly known for his attention to detail, the kind of guy who threw unopened mail into drawers and trusted that if his debit card still worked, the rest must be fine. And for a few days, things stayed quiet. He came into the office late as usual, spinning his chair like a bored teenager, shooting finger guns at people who didn't laugh back anymore, tossing crumpled Post-its into the trash like he was practicing for the NBA. I watched him through the glass of my corner office, not every day, not obsessively, but enough to see that nothing about his behavior had changed. He still acted like the golden sun, like the world would keep catching him, no matter how high he jumped or how hard he fell. What he didn't know, of course, was that his pay stub had gone blank. The system automatically stopped generating it once I removed him, which meant no money deposited into his account that Friday or the one after that. Still, nothing. Not a word from him. Not a raised eyebrow. I started to wonder if maybe he had savings I didn't know about, some secret stash he never mentioned, or maybe he thought it was a banking error and, in true Matt fashion, decided someone else would fix it eventually. But on day 12, the first text came, short, oddly polite, like he was pretending not to care. "Hey, do you know if payroll's behind this week?" I didn't answer. Not out of cruelty, but because I had nothing to say that wouldn't invite 1,000 excuses, deflections, or worse, tears. Because I knew Matt. I knew the second I explained what I did, he'd go on a charm offensive, flip the story, talk about how I'd blindsided him, how I could've just talked to him like an adult, like the dozens of talks we'd already had meant nothing. Like my silence wasn't the final, clearest message I could possibly give. A few hours later came another message, less casual this time. Still no deposit. Talked to HR. They said everything looks normal on their end. Any idea what's going on? Of course HR said that. I had instructed them not to make any changes to his files, not to trigger any alerts, not to reach out to me unless something legal surfaced. I wanted this to play out in real time in silence, with no one tipping him off, because what I wanted wasn't just for him to lose the job. I wanted him to feel the shift, to question his own reality, to sit in that uncomfortable place where entitlement begins to rot and self-reflection starts to sting. He deserved to be confused. He deserved to feel small, even just once, the way I'd felt 1,000 times, in meetings he interrupted, in family dinners where he turned my business wins into punchlines, in that damn barbecue where he laughed at my expense like it was nothing. By day 15, the messages turned frantic. He left a voicemail, his voice tight, half annoyed, half nervous, asking me to call back when I had a sec. He said there must be a glitch, asked if I could just check, and ended the message with a forced chuckle that made my skin crawl. I didn't return it. Instead, I forwarded it to a folder in my inbox labeled Matt, Implosion. I created that folder without really thinking, but once I did, I realized how long I'd been waiting for this moment, not in a vindictive way, but like someone finally exhaling after holding their breath for years. Then the emails started, first to Payroll, then to Operations, then to me. The tone shifted from confusion to concern, then quickly to indignation. He accused HR of negligence. He hinted at legal action. He copied me on one of them with a subject line that read, in all caps, "I asked this how we handle family now?" And that's when I knew I had him. Because when Matt starts invoking family, it means he's out of moves, that the charm offensive has failed and the backup parachute didn't open. And it wasn't just emails. Within 2 days, I got calls from our mother, my Aunt Denise, and even my cousin Travis, who never calls unless someone's dead or getting divorced. Each one of them tried the same angle. "He's struggling, Rachel. He just needs some clarity. You know how Matt is, he doesn't always handle stress well." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just listened, nodded, and said I'd look into it, which was the most polite lie I've ever told. Because by then, the storm had already started to gather over his head, and I was standing miles away, bone dry, watching him realize, maybe for the first time in his life, that the ground under him wasn't cracked, wasn't eroded, wasn't sabotaged by some cruel force. It was just gone. Gone, because I took it. Gone, because he never built it himself. Gone, because eventually, even the strongest bridges collapse under the weight of a man who doesn't know he's the reason they're breaking. And as I sat at my desk, sipping cold coffee while the messages poured in, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel proud. I felt something quieter, something colder, a kind of freedom that doesn't celebrate, doesn't shout, but just slips out the back door and doesn't leave a forwarding address. And I knew he wasn't done. Men like Matt never go down quietly. When a man finally realizes the walls he's been leaning on were never as strong as he thought, when the money runs out, when the emails go unanswered, when the people he used to impress stop picking up the phone, he doesn't crumble all at once. No. What he does is unravel, piece by piece, excuse by excuse, and in Matt's case, with every ounce of fake humility he could conjure from that bottomless well of self-pity, he always kept within reach like an emergency flask. And when that unraveling begins, when the cracks start to show and the desperation leaks through, the first thing he'll do, especially if he's spent a lifetime skating by on charm and pity, is crawl right back to the place he knows has always been too soft to turn him away. Our mother's front porch. I don't know exactly how he framed the story to her, but judging by the tone of her voice when she called me that Thursday evening, I can assume it had all the greatest hits, the betrayal, the confusion, the poor communication, the deep hurt of being blindsided by his own blood. She called me from the kitchen, I could tell, because I could hear the dull hum of the ceiling fan and the television in the background, that constant loop of crime procedurals she uses to drown out silence, and without even saying hello, she launched straight into it. Her voice strained in that theatrical whisper she uses when she thinks the walls are listening. "Rachel, honey, I don't understand what's going on between you and your brother," she said, as though we were children fighting over the last scoop of ice cream, not adults bound by legal documents, tax forms, and years of resentment that had calcified into something far more permanent than a childhood grudge. I didn't interrupt her, I just let her talk, let her twist herself into knots trying to mediate a situation she didn't even try to understand beyond the narrative Matt had spoon-fed her. She told me he was worried sick, that he hadn't been sleeping, that he felt humiliated, not knowing where his next check was coming from. And when I didn't respond right away, when I stayed silent longer than she expected, she threw the first real jab, subtle, but sharp enough to sting. "I know you're busy, Rachel, but sometimes I think you forget what it means to be family. I think maybe you've gotten a little cold." That word, cold, landed like a slap I hadn't seen coming, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was familiar in a way that made my teeth ache. I'd heard it before, in different contexts, with different accents, sometimes from ex-boyfriends who didn't like it when I didn't cry on cue, sometimes from employees who thought professional meant emotionless, but hearing it from my mother. After everything, after years of being the one who held the line when no one else would, after being the daughter who paid for her roof to be redone, who covered Matt's legal fees, who kept the family glued together with spreadsheets and automatic transfers while Matt floated through life like a leaf on a lazy river, that hurt in a way that made my jaw clench so tight I felt the bone lock. I could have defended myself. I could have told her about the missed deadlines, the disrespect, the subtle sabotage he'd been pulling in meetings, the rumors he let spread about not being treated like a real partner, the side gig I had just started to uncover. One that made me question whether his incompetence was just carelessness or something more calculated. I could have explained that removing him from the payroll wasn't revenge, it was damage control, a boundary set far too late, a line in the sand drawn after years of letting him bleed my company of time and dignity. But I didn't say any of that. I just told her, as gently as I could, that the situation was being handled internally, that I wasn't at liberty to discuss company matters, and that if Matt had questions, he knew how to reach me directly. She sighed, that disappointed sort of exhale that always made me feel 12 again, like I'd let her down for choosing homework over church, or refusing to apologize first after Matt stole my Halloween candy and blamed me for it. And I think that's when I really realized, that no matter how successful I became, no matter how many employees I paid, contracts I negotiated, or fires I put out daily, in her eyes, I would always be the one who could afford to bend. Because I was strong. Because I was smart. Because I didn't fall apart when things got hard. Because I didn't cry when I got hurt. And people like that, people like me, are always expected to bend, to yield, to forgive first. But not this time. Later that night, after pouring a glass of wine and sitting alone in my kitchen with the dishwasher humming and the floor beneath my bare feet cool against my skin, I opened my laptop and started digging. I hadn't looked too closely before, hadn't wanted to believe there was more beneath the surface, but now I gave myself permission to go there. And what I found didn't just confirm my worst suspicions, it made me wonder how long Matt had been playing the game behind my back. He had created a second email under a similar domain, something just different enough to slip past most people, and had been using it to communicate with a supplier we'd had a long-standing relationship with. The messages were casual at first, but over time, I could see him slipping into a tone of authority, pretending to represent the company, even discussing side deals and rates that had nothing to do with our contracts. It wasn't fraud, not exactly, nothing that would hold up in court without a deeper investigation, but it was enough to make my stomach turn. Enough to make me realize that this wasn't just laziness or entitlement anymore. This was something darker, something more manipulative, something that said, I know she won't stop me, so I'll just keep going. And maybe he was right, up until that barbecue. Maybe he really believed he'd earned a permanent pass, that no matter how many mistakes he made, I'd always clean up after him. But now? Now the blinders were off. I sat there in the half-light of my kitchen, laptop still open, wine untouched, and thought about the word my mother used, cold, and I realized something strange. Maybe I had become cold. Maybe all the years of being the fallback, the fixer, the one who swallowed her pride to keep the peace, had hardened me into someone who didn't flinch when the calls came, who didn't chase after apologies she'd never get. But cold isn't the opposite of love. Cold is what happens when love has been taken for granted too many times. Cold is what you become when warmth has been mistaken for weakness. And if that makes me the villain in his story, so be it. Because I'd rather be cold and clear-eyed than warm and used. And next time he wants to laugh in my backyard, he better hope the only thing missing is a paycheck. There's a strange kind of silence that follows the final crack in something that's been rotting for years, not the silence of peace, not the silence of completion or closure or satisfaction, but the thick, slow, eerie quiet that comes when a person finally realizes they've pushed too far, talked too loud, and overstayed their welcome in a place they never helped build, a place they only ever saw as theirs because no one told them otherwise. That's the silence Matt walked into when he sat across from me in that cheap little diner on the edge of town, the same one our dad used to take us to on Saturday mornings when we were still young enough to think chocolate milk was currency and pancakes could fix anything. The place where memory collided with consequence in the most unceremonious way possible, under flickering fluorescent lights and a waitress too tired to pretend she cared. He was already sitting there when I arrived, hunched forward over a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, wearing a shirt that didn't quite fit and a look that mixed confusion with defiance, like he still hadn't decided whether he was here to apologize or to attack. His eyes started up when I slid into the booth across from him, and for a moment, a brief, flickering moment, I saw something real in his face, something not rehearsed or performed or weaponized for sympathy. I saw fear. Not fear of me, not exactly, but fear of the unknown, fear of what it meant that I'd gone quiet, that the money had stopped, that the usual doors he kicked open with a smirk were now locked, sealed, and reinforced with bolts he couldn't pick. He started talking immediately, words tumbling out in that nervous rhythm I remembered from childhood, excuses laced with denial, justifications delivered with a shrug, every sentence dipped in the same tired marinade of, "You didn't give me a chance to explain," as if there had been some misunderstanding, as if I had jumped to conclusions instead of slowly, carefully arriving at them after years of giving him more chances than most people get in a lifetime. He said things like, "I thought we were good," and "You blindsided me," and, my personal favorite, "I thought we were building something together," which might have been laughable if it wasn't so grotesquely disconnected from reality. I didn't interrupt. I let him talk. I let him dig the hole deeper, let him try to climb out of a pit he still didn't understand he was in, because what I wanted more than anything in that moment wasn't a confession or an apology or even acknowledgement. What I wanted, what I needed, was for him to hear the silence coming from my side of the table and finally feel what it was like to speak into a void that didn't bend his narrative. And when he finally stopped, when the air between us had thickened with the weight of everything unsaid, I reached into my bag and pulled out a plain manila folder, the kind you see in courtroom dramas and corporate boardrooms, the kind of folder that doesn't need to shout because what it contains already screams loud enough. I slid it across the table without a word, and he stared at it like it might bite him. He opened it slowly, hands trembling just enough for me to notice, and as he scanned the printed emails, the transaction records, the duplicate domain addresses, the side agreements he never thought I'd see, I watched the color drain from his face in increments. Not all at once, but in waves, like a tide pulling away from a shore that had always protected him. He closed the folder without looking up and let out a breath he didn't seem to realize he'd been holding, then finally met my eyes with a look I couldn't quite place, somewhere between shame and fury, the look of a man who had finally, undeniably, run out of runway. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he muttered, voice low and cracked, like the words themselves were scraping their way out of his throat. But I wasn't interested in intentions. I wasn't interested in the emotional performance of regret or the soft tremble of a voice trying to summon sympathy it hadn't earned. I was interested in the truth, not his version, but the one that lived in the data, in the patterns, in the decisions he made when he thought I wasn't watching. So I looked at him, really looked, and said, "You weren't just stealing money, Matt. You were stealing my name. You were using everything I built to build something of your own in the shadows, and the only reason it didn't work is because you're too damn sloppy to cover your tracks." He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize either. He just sat there, mouth pressed into a thin, white line, like he was holding back words he knew wouldn't help. And in that moment, I realized he wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry he'd been caught, sorry that I'd stopped playing my part, sorry that the person he thought would always come running had finally stopped running toward him and started running away. I told him I wouldn't be pressing charges, not because he didn't deserve it, but because I didn't want to spend another second of my life dealing with his mess in a courtroom where he'd cry and beg and turn the whole thing into another stage for his victim act. I told him his access was permanently revoked, that I'd already notified the suppliers he'd been dealing with, that the board had been informed and the papers filed. I told him there would be no negotiation, no reinstatement, no conversation beyond this one. And when he opened his mouth to argue, I raised my hand, not aggressively, just firmly, and said, "Don't. Just don't. Because this isn't yours anymore. It never was." We sat in silence for another minute, maybe two, while the waitress refilled our waters and pretended not to notice the tension. Then I stood, gathered my things, and left the folder behind on the table like a tombstone for a relationship that had finally died, not with a scream, but with a sigh. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew he'd be sitting there for a while, trying to figure out how everything had unraveled, trying to piece together a new story he could tell to anyone who'd still listen. In the weeks that followed, the calls didn't stop. If anything, they increased. More family members reached out, some with genuine concern, others with that thinly veiled judgment that only shows up when a woman finally chooses self-preservation over peacekeeping. I didn't return most of them. I didn't explain myself. Because I was done explaining. Done justifying. Done pretending that loyalty is owed to someone just because you share a last name. Matt moved back in with our mother, at least temporarily. That much I know. He's telling people he's taking a break, starting fresh, getting clarity, whatever that means. I hear he's talking about launching his own company, that he's learned a lot from his time at mine. And maybe he has. Maybe he's learned how fragile success is when it's not yours to begin with. Maybe he's learned that highlights don't matter if you never played the game. Or maybe he's learned nothing at all. But me? I've learned something I wish I'd known 10 years earlier. You don't owe anyone your silence just because they call you family. You don't have to keep carrying the weight just because everyone else is too weak to lift it. And you don't have to let someone sit at your table just because they were there when you were hungry. He laughed once and said I could watch the highlights online. Well, now he's the one watching. Watching what it looks like when the person you underestimated finally stops waiting to be respected and simply takes it. So tell me, was I wrong? Or did I finally get it right?